Green Angel by Alice Hoffman, pages 72 through 80. Every day I baked 2 loaves of bread, one to share with the dogs and the sparrows, one for my neighbor on the other side of the hill. My days were divided into tasks. I collected chestnuts in the morning, baked at noon, and late in the day I visited the piles of remembrance stones in the woods, white and black and silver. In the evenings I took out my pins. I was covered now. My feet were covered with thorns, my legs with black vines, my arms with dozens of black roses. There were 2 ravens on my shoulders, and after propping up a mirror, I'd managed a bat at the nape of my neck. Every now and then I found room for a black leaf or an inky bud about to bloom. As I worked, the sparrows nestled in the pile of hair in the corner. A sparrow wasn't a sparrow unless it could rise into the sky. Even I knew that. Soon enough, the fledglings' singed feathers had fallen out, but I didn't guess how strong their wings had become until they began to flit around the house. I didn't know what they'd been busy weaving in their nest until they presented me with their gift, a fishing net made from the strands of my own black hair. I went down to the river that very night, as far away from the forgetting shack as I could. The moon was full. Streams of silver light reminded me of my sister. She would often dance while the rest of us worked in the garden. I used to tease her for being lazy. I used to call her names and tell her she'd never amount to anything if she didn't pay attention and work harder. Now I understood that she was working hard at dancing, at laughing, at being moonlight. She wasn't like poor Heather, forgetting every step she took. My sister was learning the world as she danced. She was understanding the earth, the air, the fire of her own blood, the falling rain that made her laugh and dance even more wildly. My vision was so bad, it didn't matter if I went fishing in the day or the night. In fact, my weak eyes preferred the moonlight. Night was better, colder, lonelier. But I was hardly alone. The dogs had followed me and the sparrows had fluttered behind, enjoying their first flight beyond the confines of the house. Perhaps the fish would be more likely to drift into my net while they slept. I dipped my fingers into the cool water. I could feel the currents and the dreams of the fish, fluid and silver, like my own dreams had once been. I'd tried to go fishing several times and had always failed at the task, but this time was different. It was the net that must have called the fish, dark and floating in the water. A broken part of me. I caught 3 fish and placed them in a bucket of river water. I wrung out the black net and folded it into my pocket. The dogs followed me, the sparrows flew above me, the shining fish swam in the bucket I carried home. I cooked 1 fish for the dogs and the sparrows and me, another for my neighbor, and the third I kept in the bucket on my porch where it swam in river water like a fallen star. That night I dreamed of Aurora, but she didn't recognize me. "Where's my sister?" she called out. "What have you done with her?" Aurora still didn't know me by my new name. She backed away from the thorns and the nails and the black roses. I tried to run to her, but the vines around my legs pulled me down. I tried to reach out to her, but the thorns on my skin pinned me to the wall. I heard someone crying, and when I awoke, the cry was in my own mouth. I went to the window to see if there were any stars. Out on the porch, something was studying the bucket where the last fish swam. It was a hawk that perched on the rim of the bucket, ash-covered, starving. The hawk hadn't been able to hunt because his beak had been burned. I wonder how long it had been since he'd eaten. We'd always chased hawks from our gardens. We called them thieves and didn't like the way they scooped up the quiet rabbits and preyed upon the field mice who burrowed near the fences. Now, I didn't drive the hawk away. I let him make a dinner of the 3rd fish, down to the eyes and the bones. I wished the hawk well, certain he'd soon be on his way. But in the morning, the hawk was still on the porch, cleaning his feathers. I dressed and went outside. Without my leather jacket, I might have been afraid of his sharp talons, but I reached out my arm, and the hawk hopped on. I treated his beak with lavender oil, which my mother always said could heal nearly any burn. I knew, after all, that a hawk is not a hawk unless he can hunt. But for now, he seemed happy to perch on my shoulder. So close to me, he felt like the wind, like the highest reaches of the sky. When we went into the woods to where the old trees grew, the hawk shook so many chestnuts from the trees, I could hardly carry them all home. That day I had enough to bake 6 loaves of bread, 1 for me and the sparrows, 1 for the dogs, 1 for my neighbor, 1 for the hawk, 1 for Heather Jones, who had taken to sleeping under the old bridge where the weeds were as tall as trees. I realized that there was 1 extra loaf of bread. I wondered why I'd baked the 6th loaf. not knowing the reason until I heard footsteps out in my yard. They were quiet steps, not the looters, but the steps of someone who traveled alone. I put on my leather jacket, my nail rimmed boots, my thorn edged leggings, then went to open the door. He was so very still, I might have easily slammed the door shut without ever knowing he was there. I might have only thought it was the night outside, only the stars and the moon. But I could feel him out there, even though he was dressed all in black, his hood drawn so low so he could hide in the ashes and no one could see his face. Just a profile, just quiet. Some other girl might have slammed the door and put the bolt on. She might have shouted for the stranger to go away or set the dogs on him. But I wasn't just any girl. I was the one with a talent for gauging truth from dishonesty, copper from gold, green tea from black, a friend from an enemy. Though I could barely see his face, I knew this boy was a diamond. I could tell who he was when I touched his arm. I could tell from his boots coated with mud, from his black hooded coat. I understood how alone he was and how tired he was of running. He seemed unable to speak, but the first thing he showed me was a small portrait of his mother that he'd painted. He carried the painting close to his heart. The boy motioned that he'd been in the city, that he and his mother had been separated when the fire began. He'd hardly crossed the river and walked 100 miles to look for her. Already crossed the river and walked 100 miles to look for her. Now he was too exhausted to go on. His backpack was empty except for a box of paints and a sheaf of white paper, burned at the edges. Another girl might have been afraid of a boy who arrived with so little, who refused to show his face, who could not speak a word. But I had my armor. I had my thorns. I had already lost everyone I'd ever loved. I offered the boy the 6th loaf of bread. I felt I had baked it for him even before he'd walked into my yard. I could tell he was starving from the way he ate, huddled against the wind, his back to me. He wasn't about to let down his guard. He smelled like smoke in city streets. I wasn't sure whether this boy had lost the ability to speak or whether he had simply chosen silence. Perhaps he spoke another language entirely, one I couldn't be expected to understand. That was fine with me. In silence, there was truth. I could tell who my guest was without one syllable. A boy who ran from the fire. A boy in search of his mother. When Ghost curled up at the boy's feet, when Onion didn't growl, when the sparrows ate crumbs from his hands, when the hawk perched on his shoulder, I knew I could let him stay. I told him he could sleep in the barn. I brought out blankets and pillows. He could drink the water from the well. He could eat from the tins of food I had traded for in exchange for silver and gold, and share the soup made from asparagus. He could look at the stars with me whenever he liked. When I told him my name was Ash, he nodded as though the word was a gift. Because he couldn't tell me his name in return, I called him Diamond. He seemed to like that name as well. Something inside him shone through the dark even though he kept his face hidden, hood pulled down. When he'd gone off across the yard to sleep, I thought perhaps I'd dreamed him up. A hallucination made out of loneliness, black ink, sorrow. Perhaps he'd never existed in the first place. But even when he'd gone and was already sleeping, I could see something bright everywhere he'd walked. It was almost like having moonlight again.